Let's give Jonathan a hand as he comes on up. So again, thanks for coming out, y'all. Thanks for the people that are watching. Again, a reminder, we do these to encourage and educate you guys to create your own projects by learning from people who've been there, done it, and survived to live another day. So I'll let you barely
Yeah.
introduce yourself officially.
I am Jonathan Ade. I am the writer, director, executive producer, editor, post supervisor.
Jack of all trades. We always want to acknowledge...
By necessity.
Exactly. Cast or crew in the audience, so
yes, we
give a
have
shout out.
Elizabeth Olin and Kevin Ashworth are in the back there. Just give them a little bit. Yep. So glad to see them again.
Yeah, a little reunion.
Little one.
So we always start with story and script because without that you can't make a film.
Right.
So talk about how the story came to be and kind of the process of writing the script.
Well, I had worked with my cinematographer, Alexander Paul, on a number of projects before this one. And it came time, we had done 3 much more experimental films, shorts called the Meditation series. And we had done that about one a year for about 3 years. And it became time to sort of discuss like the next step. And we both decided we wanted to do something that was more narratively based and less exploratory, but still had that same aesthetic that we developed over those previous 3 years. And I can't tell you exactly how I came to this specific story, but I will say that I was inspired by films of like Wendy and Lucy, which, if anyone's seen, is about a young woman who's looking for her dog, and who's her best friend. And it's a very simple story with a very simple want, and it's a really effective narrative. And so I thought, well, gosh, I would love to tell a similarly simple story that kind of, has big consequences, a small thing that has big consequences, and somehow came to the Ring in the Woods kind of storyline. And I wrote it with Elizabeth in mind. I had seen her perform in a short of a mutual friend of ours that previous year, and I thought, she can really do a good job. And I would like to feature her in some way. And so her and I actually had a lot of time to work on the story because I think I gave her the script in, I want to say, fall, winter 2011, spring 2012-ish. And and that was before we had backing or funding of any kind or had done any kind of campaign. And so I think her, Alexander, and I were like the 3 origin point people. That's not a thing, but you see what I'm saying, yeah.
We find in a lot of shorts that come across our path that a lot of times it's a feature crammed into a short. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about that process of writing and going, okay, just enough, not too much, but just enough to tell the story, keep it at a certain length, all that kind of thing.
It's a process. The first draft of the script was started when the 2 people having an affair were about to leave. So we saw them leave from their point of origin, probably in LA or something, and then travel up to the campsite, have a couple days of camping, and then come back down. And I was reading it over, and I was like, well, this really begins when they're about to leave again, when they're about to leave the campsite, and the ring is missing. So you don't really know exactly where a story begins until you start writing it, and then eventually you can. I work as a video editor, so I'm always thinking in terms of editing. And so I think sometimes you don't know what you have until you start sifting through the pieces.
What? How many drafts? Kind of how long did it take you to write? Talk a little bit about that.
I want to say 6 or 7 drafts or so. First draft was probably the most wildly different because it had all that beginning stuff that I ended up cutting out. And then eventually I played with a number of ideas, that, including that we'd filmed and I decided to cut out. Like there's this deleted scene of sorts, I guess you can say, of when they're headed back, and I wanted to expound on Robert, who's the lover, I guess you could say, the homewrecker. I wanted to expound on his character a little bit, and so because the idea behind this story was to take a kind of a mistake, a moral mistake, like infidelity, and try to make you identify with everyone involved in it. That was the whole idea from the very beginning. Was supposed to be an empathetic take on infidelity, and a resensitizing to something that people have often been desensitized to because it's a very common topic. So I wanted you to get involved with Robert's character. So I had this big scene where he talked about this dream that he had, and he expounded a page and page and page, and then we ended up cutting it all out of the thing because it was just you don't have room in a short form for that.
Well, in a short film, a page is so much, and to have something that goes on for multiple pages, there's a reason it has to be there.
Well, I mean, short filmmakers are often short filmmakers out of necessity, not because they want to be making shorts. I think I'm probably one of those people sometimes, but like if you ask me like if I wanted to turn this into a feature, I would say no, because I think that I don't think expounding upon it would do it any good. I wanted to make something that exists on its own terms. But yeah, it's a tough process to try and find the balance between what do we need? Because the problem with it is that in short format is you're looking at storytelling like building blocks. It's like, what do I need to get to this next step? But of course, the experience of watching a movie is not like following a roadmap. It's an emotional experience. It has to be a visceral experience at the same time. So it's like you have to find a balance of when can we pause and chill out for a second and see how something will play out? Because if you're not invested in the characters, you don't care what road they're on. So that's the balance. Is necessity of short filmmaking is following a map, and the experience and joy of filmmaking is not following a map. So they have to sort of appeal to both.
Nice. Let's shift into pre-production a little bit because you had an interesting process. Doing my little research, first did you start on Kickstarter and then go to IFP? Talk a little bit about that process.
No, we started with IFP.
Okay, so then talk about IFP and that kind of process of fiscal sponsorship.
Yeah. Well, I can even take you further back. I'd say in 2012 we put together a fundraising packet that we took Elizabeth out into I think Malibu State Park and put her in the water, which is the first of many times we did that.
She still thanks you.
Every time, I'm sure. And we took these photographs and then put together a budget with a producer that we were working with, and we essentially laid it out to this sort of nice looking little I'd say 10-page packet, introducing the filmmakers and introducing the story and talking about a timeline, and which, by the way, I don't recommend talking about a timeline in a printed packet because that's going to change. Yeah. I really don't recommend doing that. And then we had this packet, and we had I guess a preliminary budget about $56,000 for a short, and most of that money, I would say, went into getting people to location outside of LA, because we shot in the June Lake area, which is about 6.5 hours north of here, a little bit above Mammoth Lakes. If anyone's ever been to Mammoth Mountain skiing or something like that, it's in that same area, close to Yosemite. And so we had to bring up and lodge a number of these people to do that, and that was the primary expense. It wasn't shooting on film that was expensive, at least not at first. It ended up, because no one shoots on film, we ended up getting a lot of our camera equipment pretty cheap from Panavision, because 2perf is not in high demand. So we ended up getting a lot of good deals, and we got a lot of our film stock begged, borrowed, and stolen for such a thing. So we didn't have to pay for much stock at the front for things either. So it was the back end, which I'll get to later, that was expensive. But no, the expensive thing was traveling. So what we did is we made the packet, we put the preliminary budget, and our producer told us about IFP sponsorship, and we applied, and we got it. And that ended up being a good avenue for big fish, not so much for small fish. We had it up for a while, and I think we were contacting people through email about it and that sort of thing, but it ended up being not such a big deal for small fish. But Alexander, cinematographer, he worked as a camera assistant on the show Raising Hope on Fox, and had a relationship with Lucas Neff, who's the star of that show. And we had a few meetings with him. You can call them dates. They felt like dates in every way. And by the end of the third date, we essentially say, this is what we're looking to do, and this is how much money we need to raise, and how much can you put us, help us out with? And he ended up writing, and in the end, I think he contributed about a third of the budget. So that got started in pretty much the spring or sort of January, February 2013, and we were planning to shoot in June of that year. And so Alexander and I, we did a multi-city tour on the East Coast of our hometowns, and then in New York City, which we had some people in, and we did a screening of all of our meditations. And that was more or less just to raise awareness in the event of a Kickstarter campaign, which we ended up doing in the month of May before shooting.
Talk about how important it is to have something already done, like the meditation films, to kind of give an idea with a Kickstarter thing to go, we've made something, here's something to show you, so we're just not like saying, give us money and we have nothing.
Right. I think that's probably more important for bigger fish. Okay. I think the Kickstarter thing is, because you've probably gotten lots of Kickstarters from friends, and I think everybody has, is like I think that most of the time, like, oh, I like this person, I'll support whatever they do, but I'm going to chip in $25 to $50 or something like that. But for the bigger fish, like for Lucas, him seeing meditations was a real, I think, a significant step in us and our ability to raise money in that way. And I'm hoping that Lay and Wait will be a good example of something to raise money for a feature in the future. But I think that, when you're dealing with people in a more direct way, having additional material to show for is important. I think when you're dealing with a Kickstarter campaign, a larger crowd, I think it just depends on how you attack it. Yeah, that's just my
Talk a little bit about that process. The big thing everyone says about Kickstarter is a full-time job.
Yeah, it is, absolutely.
So
100%.
What was that experience for you to obviously you traveled and did a lot of in-person things, which is kind of cool. So talk a little bit about that process for you.
Yeah, so we knew we wanted to do a Kickstarter campaign in May, and during the month of April, we shot maybe, I'd say, six or seven videos. Because I think the hardest thing about a Kickstarter campaign is that at the very beginning, there's a big push because it's new, it's launched, everything is exciting, and then at the end, like, we have to race to the finish. But I think the issue is you got to sustain that momentum over a 30-day period. And that's tough. That's really tough to do. And so we conceived of an idea of having these sort of pre-behind the scenes videos where we interviewed Elizabeth, and we interviewed our producer, and Alexander and myself had to interview our production designer. Like, we had these little spotlights where we could feature them and release them, maybe twice a week over that period. And then we would do, we did a 35mm tests where we went to Panavision and we shot footage and we screened it. And so we made a little documentary about that and released it. So we had all this kind of content too, like as if it was our own channel. Yeah. And I want to say that helped. I'm not sure exactly if it helped, but I want to say it helped. We made our goal at least,
Well, and I think especially with film, you want a visual storytelling, so you gotta kind of give people something visual to go, okay, we see what they're doing, and they're actually doing things, and the people involved in everything. Great, we're gonna get a little bit of casting with our actors in the room. Talk about a lot of process. Obviously, you talked about one of your actors is already on board. How'd you find your other two actors?
We worked with a casting director named Masada Nia, and she came to us through our producer, John. And it was our first time, well, my first time anyway, working with a casting director, and it was wonderful. It was wonderful. She already had people in mind to bring in for the role. And so I think she was also the first person we worked with where she had like a list of people who you would know. Yeah. What do you call that name?
A list?
A list of names. Yeah. Names of sorts, and for Robert, and one of them was Michael Stahl David, and that was the first time that I ever cast someone just after meeting them and having a conversation with them, which was like a little exciting in a way, or a little unpredictable, because I'm used to, because I'm not at a level where I've approached a lot of like name actors and being like, you can just be in this and you don't have to audition. Like, I think when people get to a certain point, they don't expect you to audition anymore and that sort of thing. And so that was a point where I was like, oh, this makes me a little nervous, but it's exciting. And I think what appealed to me about Michael was that he said that he had a past graffiti tagging in Chicago. And I was like, interesting. I don't know, something about that really was like, okay, this might be the right person for this role. And then Kevin came in. He was one of the people that Masada selected for and then came in and read with Elizabeth, and it all fell together into place pretty quickly.
Talk about your process with casting. Since you wrote it, did you have, how specific was people in your mind? Did you kind of like, I'm just open and whatever comes in the room, I'll have the experience?
I was really open.
Yeah?
Very much, yeah. In just a lot of ways. In fact, we were kind of thinking about like when the husband shows up, like, what age should he be in comparison? Like we considered someone like younger maybe as a possibility interesting, and we realized that it just didn't really make much sense. But I think what was really important was just the degree of I don't know, sort of an empathetic response. That's what I was looking for. Yeah. And I don't know, someone who can display with little effort. Yeah. I guess. Yeah.
Simplicity.
Exactly.
Cool. Let's talk a little bit about production. You talked a little bit about where you were shooting. Where was some of the what was the interior location of the house? Was that here? Was that?
Oh, it was all in the June Lake area.
Okay, so everything was up there.
Well, with the exception of last year, we did reshoots,
Okay.
And we did some of that in I want to say like a film ranch somewhere near LA. But for the most part, it was all in the June Lake area. Even the interior of the motel that they're staying in is the June Lake Motel, and a lot of that production design comes from the place itself. Nice. Like all of those little designs of like people fishing and like the wilderness is just like it was just perfect, because we always wanted to do something that was like a little funny, like not hilarious, but like something that like kind of mocks the experience that she went through by like being you're safe, you're indoors, but you're also like you have this imagery that invokes the great outdoors too, and this motel just was perfect for that. It had everything we were looking for. So that was the location that came into place perfectly immediately, and then we had trouble with finding a good lake for that sort of main scene where everything starts, and a good location for that. For a while we had trouble finding that, but we ended up shooting on the same property that we were staying in, which at first seemed convenient and then eventually seemed like we couldn't have done it any other way, because if we had to travel like an hour and back to set, we wouldn't have been able to make our days for sure.
Talk a little bit about that. Rehearsals, how many days did you shoot?
Well, rehearsals, I rehearsed, we had I'm sure Elizabeth will correct me on this, but I think we had something like a week or so of rehearsals before we shot, and it was primarily between Michael and Elizabeth, and we didn't rehearse any scenes from the movie at all. We were just developing backstory, so and developing an intimate vocabulary, I guess you can say. So we would develop these kind of extended improvisations of how these characters met, how they came to start courting one another, and how the relationship proceeded. There's so much backstory for this scene that was developed, and that was just for those specific moments. And then Kevin came by, and we did, I think, an abbreviated version of the same thing, because he was just in the film a little bit less.
How many days did you shoot?
We shot about 5 days for initial production, and then I'd say 3 days for our reshoots. And we were shooting up in June Lake, and it's a high altitude, and I'm sensitive to. I'm sensitive in a lot of ways, I guess, but I'm sensitive to that, and so I went up a few days earlier to try to get used to it, and it didn't kick in until the very last day of shooting. I felt like, oh, okay, yeah, I can breathe now, great. But it's kind of like training at high altitudes. When you come back down, you feel like you can do anything, That's kind of the effect of shooting in high altitudes. But yeah, about 8 days total.
Give us some behind the scenes context. Obviously, everyone's seen the film, but is there anything that happened that we didn't see? Did you have 5 seconds to shoot something before the sun went down?
Well,
that type
constantly,
of stuff?
yeah. I mean, that's the thing about being a race against time, against the sunset, is that we're filming a lot at sunset. Yeah, I think that one of our biggest logistical challenges was that like the Jeep that Robert was driving broke down constantly, and so what we ended up doing for a while was dragging it behind like an SUV kind of thing, and that wasn't really working because the I don't know, the bar that connects them wasn't maintaining. So eventually we just faked out the SUV like for those interiors. So that took a lot of time, and because we encountered those issues, I had a lot of setups for when he pulls up the soda tab out of the water. I had a lot more setups than we ended up having. I did two, just this direction and that direction, and eventually I did the shot of her like bubbling with her shirt, that's actually me. But that shot with the bubbling, that's something we reshot in a different location entirely, and that sort of thing. But yeah, I'd say about like 15% of the film was reshot in total.
Let's get into a little bit of post-production. How, if you did, or how did you feel like you prepared yourself in pre and production for post-production?
Well, like I said, I work as an editor, so I'm always thinking, you know, and actually that's the tricky thing is that like on set is that like I have to remember to say cut after I would cut in my brain. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you'd be like the shot would end there and cut. You know what I mean? Like you can't say cut when you want it to be cut in the film.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? You gotta give it some head and tails and that sort of thing. So, but I think there's a couple of moments like when a husband comes to pick her up and it's that silhouette shot of there's the headlights. We did a lot of coverage of that scene and like shots of her holding him and him getting out of the car and these mediums and whatnot. And what we ended up doing was just as soon as that played the first time, and the dust kicked up in the air, and I was like, this can probably play just this shot, just this one. I don't know. There's things you want to prepare yourself in the edit room, like by only getting what you need, but sometimes you don't know that until you're there. Yeah. And sometimes something that seemed really important is way overblown and unnecessary, like that Robert's dream sequence that I ended up cutting. So I ended up rewriting that whole scene to really function in the edit. So I rewrote that after the initial cut was done, and we were going back for reshoots, and we knew what we needed to have. Yeah. And that made reshoots so much fun, because I'm like, okay, I don't have to worry about. It's not as much of a gamble anymore. I already know like where 90% of this movie's going to be, and this is how I can improve it with these reshoots. So the weight was off my shoulders during that time. But I don't know, editing is as much an exploratory process as anything else. So I think that there's some things you can prepare for and some things you learn from and apply to, and there's some things that you cannot possibly foresee until you're there. Yeah.
You talked to a lot of filmmakers who you have a producer, director, and editor, and it's kind of a three-person kind of triangle conversation, argument, fill in the blank of trying to make the film work. How is it when you're kind of the same person and you're like three people in one? How do you separate yourself as like, okay, I'm looking at this as the director, I'm looking at this as the editor. What was that process for you?
Well, we actually had an editor at first, really, really lovely guy. We just couldn't keep paying him. And I work as an editor, so I was like, well, it would be really lovely if I had the opportunity and the budget to work with an editor, have that different perspective on it than I have. Because like when you work as an editor, it's really easy to get bogged down in the details, very easy indeed. And I think the way I balanced that was I sent cuts to people I trust. It's just like what do you think of this? What is working? What isn't working? We'd have full screenings and have feedback sessions and that sort of thing, and kind of seeing where things land and where they didn't in the process. I think it's a really hard challenge to do it this way, especially if you've got no one to answer to except yourself. Yeah. But I don't know. I think in the end, being an editor overrides maybe a directorial spirit of everything being too precious. You know what I mean? Like, we can't cut that shot. It took us this, and that days. I'm the first person to say cut it out. So I think being an editor really helps me not hold on to production as much and just say, well, this is what we have to work with. You know, how can we make it work?
You're willing to kill those babies to make a better film.
Just toss them.
Toss them. Get rid of them.
Into the river.
So then this kind of loops in for a first-time director. Is that the main thing that an editor needs, is to go, say what you want, but know that you're probably not going to get everything that you're hoping for? Is that the conversation?
I'm sorry,
from an editor's point of view, what does an editor need from like a director, first-time director?
Oh, like if an editor was working with a first-time director, what the conversation would be like?
Yeah, what would be helpful to the editor?
Because I've worked with first-time directors as an editor on features, and because they have an idea of what they want in their head and the editor's job is to tell you this is what you have. I think the earlier you have that conversation, the better, and it doesn't have to be confrontational anyway. You know, I think it's like I'm here because like anyone can really put it together. Yeah. Anyone can press the keys. I think what an editor's true purpose is to provide a perspective that the director doesn't have. And I think as long as you understand each other on the front end, like you will butt heads, as I had butt heads with my director before, when something that they want to be is not. But as long as you have the conversation on the front end, I think that it will help through the process for sure.
We're going to wrap up what we call the kind of the golden nugget questions, and you have a lot of kind of point of views on this. So I'm going to ask you to answer this question as a writer and as a director. So maybe the same or a separate answer. What is your if a first-time writer or first-time director, if they could only remember one thing out of this conversation, what would you want them to remember as they're making their first short film? No pressure.
Yeah, right. Just fail. Just fail. No, like, but really, like, you know, you only learn by failing. And I think it's a lot less expensive to learn as a writer by failing than it is a director by failing. But it's the same process, you know. You have to be bold, and you have to try things. And you really try things, and sometimes they're not going to work, and that's fine. That's no indication on your ability to learn from those things and to carry forward. So fail. That's just a good common thing that I've heard for any kind of creative pursuit is fail often, and fail hard.
And then as you showed with your films, you just kept going no matter what. You just made the next project and make the next project and make the next project.
And learned a lot from each one, Yeah. And I'm sure there'll be things about anything that I do in the future that, like for instance, I was in this residency in Nebraska City this year in March, and I wanted to do this like experimental documentary where I went out and filmed the town at sunset. This kind of like, I'd say it's like it's kind of a quiet, sleepy town, but it also has like this kind of feeling because it's in Nebraska of like desolation a little bit. No offense to anyone from Nebraska, I think it's a beautiful country. I really do. But it definitely has this like the space to it that's really unreal. So I'd film this at sunset, not knowing what it would be, and then I would record audio of people in their town and ask them what they think their town is going in 50 years. So it's kind of this like apocalyptic kind of, I don't know, experimental documentary of sorts. And like I was working on it just a month ago, and like it wasn't really working exactly how I wanted it to work. And I was like, it's okay. Like this doesn't mean I'm a bad filmmaker. This just means like I am trying something and I'm failing at that, and that's totally fine. And to like, I think it's a hard lesson to learn that like what you do isn't necessarily who you are. Yeah. But.
And what are your next projects or next goals, or what are you looking to do?
Oh, I have goals, all right.
Yeah.
I do. I got dreams too. I've been wanting to do a feature film forever, like a lot of people, but that's something that I've been wanting to do since for about 8 years or so. I have a story in mind, a coming of age story set in the it's a period piece, but it's set in 2002. So it's not set long ago, but just like American Graffiti was set 10 years before it was made, I think that things have changed in society long enough to like you can make a period piece 10 years ago and it could be quite different from the experience that you have now. And so it's a movie about teenagers in that period that I would very much like to do, very much like to do next. But like, you know, I'm back to square one like we were on this project, which laying wait seemed impossible at the time when we were starting it too. So I think it's just saying the thing out loud and then, you know, holding yourself to it that makes it happen.
Well, when it does happen, you'll come back here and show it to us once.
Certainly, yeah.
Awesome. Let's say thank you to Jonathan for his process.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.